Mr. Speaker, the Conservative government established the Ukraine Family Scheme. However, a family of 6 from Gaza have applied to live in Britain using this scheme, and a judge has now ruled in their favour. This decision is completely wrong. It cannot be allowed to stand.
Mr. Speaker, let me be clear. I do not agree with the decision. She's right. It's the wrong decision. It should be Parliament that makes the rules on immigration. It should be the government that makes the policy. That is the principle, and the Home Secretary is already looking at the legal loophole which we need to close in this particular case.
There are millions of people all around the world in terrible situations. We cannot help them all, and we certainly cannot bring them all here.
In a dramatic turn of events, Prime Minister Keir Starmer found himself at the centre of an unprecedented political storm after his public criticism of a high-profile court ruling. The controversy erupted during a heated parliamentary debate on February 12, when Starmer, responding to a question about a judicial decision regarding a Gaza refugee family, made a bold and, some argue, reckless declaration. With a tone of absolute certainty, he dismissed the ruling as wrong and insisted that it was Parliament, not the courts, that should have the final say on immigration policy. The statement, delivered with his characteristic confidence, sent shockwaves through the legal and political establishment. This was no minor critique, it was an outright challenge to the judiciary's authority. Starmer, a former human rights lawyer and director of public prosecutions, was expected to champion the rule of law. Instead, he openly undermined it. His words suggested that judges had overstepped their bounds, creating loopholes rather than applying existing legislation. Yet in reality, the ruling in question was based on human rights laws that Parliament itself had passed. The irony was undeniable. A man who had built his career on legal integrity was now publicly discrediting the very system he once swore to uphold. His comments did more than spark political debate. They ignited a constitutional crisis, raising urgent questions about the separation of powers and the dangers of a prime minister willing to erode judicial independence for the sake of political posturing.
Mr. Speaker, let me be clear. I do not agree with the decision. She's right. It's the wrong decision. She hasn't quite done her homework because the decision in question was taken under the last government.
The backlash from the judiciary was swift and unrelenting. Lady Chief Justice Baroness Carr, the highest judicial authority in England and Wales, took the extraordinary step of publicly rebuking the Prime Minister, an event virtually unheard of in modern British politics. Judges are traditionally restrained figures, avoiding public dispute with politicians to preserve the impartiality of the courts. But Starmer's comments had crossed a line so severe that silence was no longer an option. Baroness Carr did what no Chief Justice had done in living memory. She condemned a sitting Prime Minister in a formal press conference, calling his remarks unacceptable and a direct attack on judicial independence. Her outrage was not just rhetorical, she took concrete action, writing a letter to Starmer and the Lord Chancellor, making it clear that his words threatened the very foundations of Britain's democratic system. The significance of this moment cannot be overstated. For a Chief Justice to publicly challenge the head of government is a flashing red warning sign of constitutional crisis. Starmer's remarks were not just an offhand political jab. They were an erosion of the separation of powers, a dangerous precedent that could pave the way for future attacks on the judiciary. Baroness Carr's intervention was a rare, decisive stand against creeping authoritarianism, a reminder that even the most powerful leaders are not above the law. In calling out the Prime Minister, she was not just defending a single court ruling, she was safeguarding the integrity of British democracy itself.
But, Mr. Speaker, let me be clear. It should be Parliament that makes the rules on immigration. It should be the government that makes the policy. That is the principle, and the Home Secretary is already looking at the legal loophole which we need to close in this particular case.
The political fallout from Starmer's attack on the judiciary was immediate and severe. What was intended as a display of strength quickly spiraled into a public relations disaster, exposing deep cracks in his leadership and raising serious concerns about his commitment to democratic principles. Legal experts, opposition figures, and even some within his own party condemned his remarks, warning that undermining judicial independence for political gain was a dangerous road to travel. Starmer's misrepresentation of the court ruling, painting it as judicial overreach rather than the lawful application of existing human rights laws, only deepened the crisis. His words played directly into a populist narrative that seeks to delegitimize the courts. portraying judges as obstacles to the will of the people rather than guardians of justice. Beyond the immediate backlash, this controversy dealt a lasting blow to Starmer's credibility. For a leader who built his political brand on legal expertise and a commitment to the rule of law, this moment of recklessness shattered the carefully crafted image of a principled statesman. His critics seized on the irony. A former human rights lawyer, once a defender of judicial independence, now standing in Parliament denouncing a judge's decision simply because it was politically inconvenient. With public trust in politicians already fragile, Starmer's actions sent a troubling message that even a Prime Minister with a legal background was willing to sacrifice democratic norms to score political points. In his attempt to appear decisive, he instead revealed himself as dangerously short-sighted.
She complains about scripted answers and questions. Her script doesn't allow her to listen to the answer.
Prime Minister.
She asked me if we're going to change the law and close the loophole in question 1. I said yes. She asked me again in question 2, and I said yes. She asked me again in question 3. It's still yes.
The consequences of Starmer's reckless rhetoric extended far beyond politics, plunging the judiciary into an escalating crisis of security and legitimacy. By publicly dismissing a judge's ruling as wrong, and implying that courts were interfering in parliamentary authority, he fueled a dangerous narrative, one that painted judges as political adversaries rather than impartial arbiters of the law. The ripple effects of such statements were immediate and alarming. Reports emerged of growing hostility toward members of the judiciary, with judges facing an unprecedented wave of online harassment, abuse, and even direct threats. Baroness Carr herself sounded the alarm, revealing that judges across Britain were increasingly concerned for their safety, with some even fearing for their lives. The threats were not just theoretical. In a chilling incident, a judge was physically attacked in his own courtroom, struck with a radiator by an enraged defendant, an act of violence that underscored the rising dangers faced by legal professionals. The growing hostility toward the judiciary forced officials to consider drastic measures, including the creation of a dedicated police force for judges, similar to security protections in. This grim reality exposed the true cost of Starmer's words. When political leaders delegitimize the courts, they embolden those who seek to undermine the rule of law through intimidation and violence. His remarks were more than just a political miscalculation. They were a reckless gamble that put the safety of the judiciary at risk and chipped away at the very foundations of British democracy.
They put the complete opposite argument. She talks about on top of her breath. She has no idea what she's talking about. I'll tell her again. We need to change the law. That's why the Home Secretary is already closing the gap. I know the script doesn't allow any adaptation, but this is getting tedious.
Starmer's attack on the judiciary was not an isolated incident. It was part of a larger pattern that revealed a stark disconnect between his promises and his actions. As a candidate, he presented himself as a principled leader who would restore faith in British institutions, uphold the rule of law, and govern with integrity. But in power, his behavior told a different story. His willingness to publicly undermine judicial independence was just one example of a troubling trend, saying whatever was politically expedient in the moment, even if it contradicted his supposed core values. This pattern extended far beyond the courts. On immigration, he vowed to bring a fair and just system, yet his rhetoric increasingly mirrored that of hardline conservatives. On economic policy, he campaigned on helping working families, yet his government prioritized military spending and international optics over the struggles of ordinary Britons. Nowhere was this contradiction more evident than in his handling of foreign affairs. Critics accused him of shaping policy based on how it would be perceived internationally, rather than focusing on tangible benefits for British citizens. His approach to issues like Ukraine and Gaza seemed driven by political calculations, rather than genuine conviction. Meanwhile, public trust in his leadership continued to erode. Polls showed rising disillusionment as voters began to recognize the widening gap between what Starmer promised and what he delivered. His attack on the judiciary was not just a misstep. It was a symbol of a broader failure, exposing a leader more concerned with optics than with the principles he once claimed to defend. See you later.